But first, the Greens' brinkmanship over Labor's climate plans to stop all new coal and gas developments, the Greens say, will block your mechanism to reduce emissions by 43% over the next 7 years, is the latest sign that the government's extended honeymoon is over. Here's the pitch from Labor's Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, of course the same bloke who let the illegal boats back in the last time he was in government.
The Greens will ultimately have to decide, do they want to vote for that or against it? For the 200 million tonnes of emissions reduction or against it? For the equivalent of taking 2/3 of the cars off the road or against it? Now again, we have a relationship with the Greens where we can talk issues through, but within parameters. And the parameters in which I will discuss these issues is the election mandate we sought and received.
In response, the Greens today upped the ante.
We've made an offer to the government to back all of their scheme with one condition, and that is that they stop opening new coal and gas projects.
The problem for Labor is that governments can't coast through trying to be all things to everyone. Hard choices do have to be made, and some constituencies will inevitably be alienated, as they're fast finding out. My sense, though, is just as the government won the Greens over on The Voice by giving them private assurances about continuing so-called First Nations sovereignty, about treaties and about rewriting history, in this case too the government will win over the Greens by giving private, secret assurances that no new coal mines or gas fields will ever open, only they'll block them using environmental legislation rather than an outright ban, as the Greens want. But what about the mechanism the government's planning to use, that the Greens currently say they'll block, that is said to be no big deal because it was legislated by the Abbott government? Well, as the alternative to Labor's $23 a tonne carbon tax, the Abbott government introduced the Emissions Reduction Fund, about $1 billion a year to support tree planting, soil improvements, energy-saving technology, all measures that made good economic sense anyway, and also reduced emissions. Part of that was a mechanism to penalise large emitters if they increased their emissions intensity, the carbon dioxide they produced per unit of output. Now, it was a safeguard mechanism, not a punitive mechanism, as demonstrated by the fact there was no revenue attributed to it, and under the coalition it was never actually used to impose extra burden on business that stayed within the business as usual parameters. Now, Labor wants to weaponise it by changing the regulations to force Australia's 215 largest emitters, so that's most of our big manufacturers and a lot of our big mining companies, to reduce their emissions by 5% per annum. And if they can't, to buy carbon credits at the cost of up to $75 a tonne, or 3 times as much as Gillard's carbon tax. So far from being just a variant of coalition policy, Labor's plan is a perversion of it. It's using it for a totally different and very destructive purpose. As Senator Matt Canavan pointed out when Labor first announced this plan, it amounts to a $15 billion a year tax on businesses that employ hundreds of thousands of Australians. But what the Greens are doing here is much more likely to end up making a bad situation worse than thwarting it, because Labor will give in to the Greens via the back door, if not the front door. We've already seen Labor's Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek block a big new coal mine in central Queensland on the grounds, she says, that it posed an unacceptable climate risk. Almost certainly the government will privately assure the Greens that this will always be the case for every new fossil fuel development in order to get them on board. So see this latest stoush for the play acting it is. One way or another, under this government, there will be no more coal or gas developments in this country, even though that will eventually jeopardise both our export income and our tax revenues. Not to mention our energy security at a time when the world in our region is more uncertain than ever.